There is a place, deep in the heart of Eastern Europe, where the mountains do not merely rise, they loom, where the forests grow so dense and so dark that even on clear summer afternoons, the light gives up somewhere between the canopy and the forest floor, where the rivers run cold and fast and ancient, and the villages that cling to the valley walls have names that feel, even now, like they belong to another world entirely. This is Transylvania. And it is here, sometime around the year 1431, that a child was born into a world already on fire. His name was Vlad, the second of that name in his family, son of a warlord, grandson of a prince, heir to a throne that had already cost more blood than most kingdoms see in a century. He would go on to become one of the most feared men in the history of the medieval world. A ruler so brutal, so deliberate, and so strategically merciless that the stories told about him would outlive not just his enemies, but his entire civilization. He would become known as Vlad the Impaler. And yet, and this is the thing that history so often forgets, he was also, by almost every measure available to us, a hero, to his people, to his land, to the idea of a nation struggling simply to exist against forces that would have swallowed it whole. The truth of Vlad Dracula is not a simple story. It is not a horror story. It is something rarer and more unsettling than that. It is a human story, one of survival, of trauma inherited across generations, of a man shaped by betrayal so profound that ruthlessness became not a personality flaw, but a political philosophy. To understand Vlad, we must first understand Wallachia. Wallachia was a small principality, a territory really, pressed between the Ottoman Empire to the south, the Kingdom of Hungary to the north and west, and the Principality of Moldavia to the east. It was, in the language of geopolitics, a buffer state, a piece of contested ground over which empires argued, and over which the people who actually lived there had very little say. The throne of Wallachia was not inherited cleanly. It was a prize, fought over by rival branches of the same royal family, the House of Bessarab, in a cycle of assassination, exile, and return that made governance nearly impossible and personal safety a daily negotiation with fate. In the span of a single century, Wallachia would see dozens of rulers, many of whom died violently and in office. Vlad's father, known to history as Vlad II, earned the name Dracula, meaning dragon or devil, depending on who you asked. After being inducted into the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric order founded by the Holy Roman Emperor to defend Christian Europe against the Ottoman advance. Before we continue, if these stories have become part of your nights, consider subscribing to the channel as we prepare another story for you. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the story. It was a title of honor. It was also, in the folklore of the region, a title that carried weight of a different kind entirely, when Vlad II named his son Dracula, meaning son of the dragon or son of the devil. He likely did not imagine that name echoing through 6 centuries of human memory. But it has. Young Vlad's childhood was not a peaceful one. It could not have been. He was raised in the courts of Wallachia during a period of almost constant political instability, and somewhere around the age of 11 or 12, he was handed to the Ottoman Empire as a hostage, a diplomatic guarantee that his father would not move against the Sultan's interests. He and his younger brother Radu were taken south into Ottoman lands and held there for years. What happened to Vlad during those years of captivity remains, in many of its details, a matter of scholarly debate. What we know is this: he was educated. He was treated, by most accounts, reasonably well, as hostages of political value often were. He learned Turkish. He learned Ottoman military strategy. He learned to see power not as something granted by birthright alone, but as something constructed, maintained, and enforced. He also learned, perhaps more importantly than anything else, what it felt like to be powerless. And when he returned, when the boy finally came home to a Wallachia that had already swallowed his father and his older brother in yet another cycle of assassination and betrayal, he returned as something different, something that had been tempered by years of careful observation, political survival, and a very quiet, very patient, very particular kind of rage. He was not yet the Impaler. Not yet. But the world was about to give him every reason to become one. There is a particular kind of damage that only betrayal can do. Not the betrayal of strangers. That is merely misfortune. Not the betrayal of enemies. That is simply war. The betrayal that reshapes a person, that reaches into the architecture of who they are and rearranges something fundamental and permanent, is the betrayal of those who were supposed to protect you. Vlad Dracula understood this kind of betrayal before he was old enough to fully name it, and by the time he came into his power, by the time the world handed him both a throne and an army, he had been shaped by it so completely that mercy to him was not a virtue. It was a vulnerability, and vulnerabilities, he had learned, were how you lost everything. To understand why Vlad became the man he became, we must go back, not just to his years in Ottoman captivity, but further still, back to a political world so treacherous, so saturated with double-dealing and sudden violence, that a man who was not ruthless was not merely weak, he was already dead. He simply had not yet fallen down. Vlad's father, Vlad Dracula, had always walked a razor's edge. On one side stood the Ottoman Empire, vast, expanding, hungry, and fully capable of crushing Wallachia beneath its heel without breaking stride. On the other stood the Kingdom of Hungary, led at this time by John Hunyadi, one of the great Christian military commanders of the age, a man who had made it his life's work to push the Ottomans back, and who expected the princes of the borderlands to serve as his instruments in that effort. Vlad Dracula's great failure, or perhaps his great tragedy, was that he could never fully commit to either side. He shifted, he negotiated, he bought time with promises he did not always keep, and loyalty he did not always mean. It was the statecraft of survival, and it worked more or less for years. But it made him enemies on both sides of every border. In 1447, when young Vlad and his brother Radu were still held in the south as Ottoman guarantors, Vlad Dracula was assassinated. The details vary across sources, but the shape of the event is consistent. He was killed, almost certainly with the knowledge and approval of John Hunyadi himself, whom he had failed and frustrated one too many times. His eldest son, Mircea, Vlad's older brother, heir to the throne, was captured shortly afterward by Wallachian boyars, the powerful noble class whose loyalties shifted with the wind, and whose cooperation was essential to any prince who wanted to rule, rather than merely occupy a seat. Mircea was blinded with hot iron pokers. Then he was buried alive. Vlad was perhaps 14 or 15 years old when this happened. He received the news in Ottoman captivity, far from home, powerless to intervene, powerless even to mourn in any way that the world would have recognized as safe. He was a political asset, a diplomatic piece on a board he had not chosen to play on. His grief was his own business, and it was required to stay that way. This moment matters, not because it explains everything about what Vlad would later become. History resists explanations that clean and complete, but because it established something in him about the nature of power and the price of weakness. His father had been too careful, too compromising, too willing to bend in the hope that bending would keep him standing. It had not saved him. His brother had been too exposed, too trusting of men who owed him nothing and feared him even less. They were gone, and Vlad was still here. That arithmetic was not lost on him. He made his first attempt at the Wallachian throne in 1448, at around 16 years of age, backed by Ottoman support. He held it for approximately 2 months before being driven out by Hunyadi's forces and the return of a rival claimant. He fled. He survived. He waited. And this is another quality that history does not always grant Vlad: patience. He spent the years between 1448 and 1456 in a careful, deliberate rebuilding. He spent time in Moldavia, at the court of his uncle Bogdan, learning what a functioning principality actually looked like from the inside. He watched how power was organized, how loyalty was cultivated, how a ruler built a court that did not immediately begin plotting against him. He spent time, eventually, in the court of John Hunyadi himself, the very man almost certainly responsible for his father's death. That detail is worth sitting with for a moment. Vlad, in order to survive, in order to one day reclaim what was his, went and made himself useful to his father's killer. He suppressed whatever he felt about that. He learned. He observed. He absorbed everything Hunyadi knew about military strategy, about command, about the mechanics of holding territory under constant external pressure. And he waited. Hunyadi died of plague in 1456, shortly after the great Christian victory at the Siege of Belgrade. Within weeks, Vlad moved. His return to Wallachia in 1456 was not a triumphant coronation. It was a calculated strike, backed now by Hungarian support. Hunyadi's successors found Vlad a useful ally, a man who knew Ottoman methods and had every personal reason to oppose them. He seized the throne and immediately set about the work that would define his reign. That work was, in its most basic form, the project of making himself unkillable. Not physically, no man could manage that, but politically, structurally. The great vulnerability of every Wallachian prince before him had been the boyars, the noble class whose wealth, whose land, whose private armies, and whose networks of alliance gave them the power to make and unmake rulers at will. They had made his father. They had helped destroy him. They had buried his brother alive. Vlad intended to solve this problem with a thoroughness that had not been attempted before. The stories that emerge from this period are many, and some are certainly exaggerated in the retelling. Accounts written by Saxon merchants with their own grievances, or by Ottoman propagandists with obvious motives. But the core of them is consistent enough across enough independent sources that historians are largely agreed on the essential shape of what happened. Vlad moved against the boyar class systematically and without sentiment. There is one story, told in several variations across multiple contemporary accounts, of a feast. Vlad invited a large number of the older boyar families, men who had lived through the reigns of multiple princes and who carried with them the institutional memory of every betrayal and every assassination that had defined Wallachian politics for generations. He hosted them, fed them, and then, at some point during the evening, he asked them, quite directly, how many princes they had personally seen come and go during their lifetimes. The answers, by all accounts, were high. Some said dozens. Vlad listened, and then he had them arrested. Many were impaled that same night. Others were marched, along with their families, to the ruins of a fortress on the Arjas River, and forced to build it back up with their own hands. In their fine clothes, which fell apart over weeks and months of labor, until those who survived the work did so in rags. That fortress became Poenari Castle. It stands today, or what remains of it does, perched on a cliff above the Arges Gorge, silent, skeletal, and still remarkable. Vlad was not simply being cruel for its own sake, though cruelty was certainly present. He was being surgical. He was dismantling a power structure that had consumed every prince before him, replacing it with something he could actually control. A new class of administrators and lesser nobles who owed their positions entirely to him, who had no independent base of power, and who therefore had every reason to remain loyal. It was governance through terror. And it worked. Within the first years of his reign, Wallachia was, by most contemporary accounts, more orderly, more secure, and more internally stable than it had been in living memory. Trade moved more freely. Roads were safer. The mechanisms of daily life, taxation, administration, justice, functioned with a consistency that his predecessors had never managed to produce. The people, in many cases, did not fear him the way the boyars did. Some of them, in fact, loved him because Vlad Dracula understood something that a great many rulers before and since have failed to grasp, that the population of a country and the powerful men who claim to represent it are not always the same thing, and that sometimes protecting one requires doing something permanent about the other. He had learned that lesson at a cost no child should ever be asked to pay, and now, with a throne beneath him and an army at his back, he was prepared to teach it to the rest of the world. The Impaler had not yet earned his name, but the classroom was open. There are moments in history that do not make it into the songs, not because they are unimportant. Often, they are among the most important things that ever happened, but because they are too strange, too dark, too far outside the comfortable boundaries of heroism, as we prefer to imagine it. They are the moments where the man who saved something did so in a way that makes gratitude feel complicated, where the victory is real and the method is something you cannot look at directly for very long. The summer of 1462 is one of those moments, and to understand it fully, to understand what Vlad did and why he did it, and what it cost, and what it prevented, we have to first understand the scale of what was coming toward him. Mehmed II was not an ordinary conqueror. He was, by the time he turned his attention to Wallachia, already one of the most accomplished military commanders in the world. He had taken Constantinople in 1453, an event that sent shockwaves through all of Christendom, that ended the Byzantine Empire, which had stood for over 1,000 years, that fundamentally reorganized the political and spiritual geography of the known world. He had done this at the age of 21. In the years that followed, he had continued expanding with a methodical, almost serene relentlessness. He was educated, multilingual, genuinely curious about the world, and possessed of a military genius that combined bold strategic vision with meticulous logistical planning. The armies he commanded were the finest fighting force on earth, experienced, disciplined, enormous in number, and supplied by an empire whose resources dwarfed anything the small Christian principalities of Eastern Europe could muster. When Mehmed decided that something needed to be conquered, it was conquered. Wallachia, in 1462, had given him a reason to decide exactly that. Vlad had spent the early years of his reign in a delicate relationship with the Ottomans, paying tribute when he had to, resisting when he could, always measuring the distance between what was possible and what would bring the full weight of Ottoman power down on a principality that could not, in any conventional sense, survive a direct confrontation with it. But by 1461 and into 1462, that relationship had collapsed entirely. Vlad had stopped paying tribute. He had conducted raids across the Danube into Ottoman-held Bulgaria, devastating towns and military installations with a ferocity that was both militarily effective and deliberately, almost theatrically, provocative. He had intercepted Ottoman diplomatic envoys, men who carried the legal protections of their office, and had them impaled on the grounds that they had refused to remove their turbans in his presence, which he interpreted as a gesture of disrespect to his authority. Whether that interpretation was genuine or merely convenient, the effect was the same. Mehmed sent an army estimated at between 60 and 90,000 men across the Danube in the summer of 1462. Some sources place the number higher. Vlad's own forces, his actual standing army, numbered somewhere between 20 and 30,000 at most, and that figure is likely generous. He was outnumbered, outgunned in every material sense, and facing an adversary who had never failed to take what he had decided to take. What Vlad did next was not what anyone expected. He did not wait behind walls. He did not form battle lines and offer the Ottomans the kind of open engagement in which their numerical and logistical superiority would have been simply overwhelming. He understood, with the clarity that comes from years of studying a far more powerful enemy, that he could not beat Mehmed's army in any fight that Mehmed's army was designed to win. So he changed the nature of the fight entirely. Vlad employed what we would today call a scorched earth strategy, combined with sustained guerrilla warfare, with a psychological dimension so extreme that it defies easy categorization. As the Ottoman forces advanced north into Wallachia, they found nothing useful waiting for them. Wells had been poisoned, crops had been burned, livestock had been driven away or slaughtered, villages had been evacuated. The land itself had been stripped of anything that could feed or sustain an army on the move. Mehmed's forces were enormous, and enormous forces need to eat. Vlad's own people suffered terribly for this strategy. There is no way to soften that. The deliberate destruction of the land that sustained them was a catastrophic burden placed on the Wallachian peasantry, many of whom had already endured years of hardship and uncertainty. Vlad asked his own people to lose everything, so that the Ottoman army might be slowed, weakened, and unnerved. It is one of the recurring moral complexities of his reign, that the man who was, in many ways, fighting for his people, frequently asked his people to bear costs that were nearly unbearable. But the strategy was working. Vlad's forces attacked at night, in small, fast-moving groups, striking supply lines, cutting off isolated units, ambushing foraging parties, and then vanishing back into forests they knew better than any Ottoman commander ever could. They denied Mehmed's army sleep, denied it certainty, denied it the clean, decisive engagement it was built to win. And then, sometime in June of 1462, Vlad attempted something that has no real precedent in the military history of the period. He rode directly for Mehmed, in the middle of the night, with the force of cavalry estimated at between 7,000 and 10,000 men, dressed, according to some accounts, in Ottoman military clothing, moving through the dark with a discipline and silence that speaks to how completely Vlad had absorbed the lessons of his years among the Ottomans. He launched a direct assault on the Sultan's camp with the specific, personal objective of killing Mehmed II. The night attack, as it is known to history, came extraordinarily close to succeeding. The Ottoman camp descended into chaos. Men fought in the dark, unable to distinguish friend from enemy. The psychological terror of the assault, the speed, the darkness, the uniforms, the sudden eruption of violence from an enemy that was not supposed to be able to reach them, produced a panic that rippled through an army of tens of thousands. Vlad's cavalry cut through to within what contemporary sources describe as a very short distance of Mehmed's personal tent before the Sultan's guards and elite Janissary units were able to organize a coherent defense. Mehmed was not killed. The assault ultimately had to be withdrawn as Ottoman forces rallied. But the Sultan had been shaken by the accounts of his own chroniclers, sources with no motive to flatter Vlad. Mehmed was visibly disturbed by what he had encountered. This was not an enemy who fought by rules he recognized. This was something else. What he found as his army continued north in the days that followed did nothing to settle his nerves. Outside Vlad's capital city of Taugovinte, the Ottoman advance guard encountered something that stopped them. Not a wall, not an army, not a fortification of any conventional kind. A forest, or rather, something that had been made to look like a forest, stretching across the approach to the city, covering an area that contemporary sources describe as approximately a kilometer wide and several kilometers deep, were stakes. Thousands upon thousands of wooden stakes, driven into the earth at angles, rising to varying heights, arranged in careful rows that receded into the distance. And on each stake, impaled and long dead, was a human body. The Ottomans, who had been taken prisoner in previous engagements. Soldiers. Some sources suggest Bulgarian collaborators. The numbers cited in contemporary accounts range from 20,000 to as high as 30,000. Figures that historians debate, but that no serious scholar suggests were fabricated from nothing. It was a message, composed in a language that required no translation, addressed to an audience of one, and designed to communicate a single, unambiguous thing. This is who I am. This is what I am willing to do. Consider whether you still want to come any further. Mehmed's chronicler, a man named Tursun Beg, who was present, recorded that the Sultan himself, upon seeing the field of stakes, fell silent, that the army halted, that even men who had fought at Constantinople, who had seen every variety of battlefield horror that the age could produce, were visibly shaken. Mehmed reportedly said that he could not conquer the land of a man capable of such things, that a man who could do this to his enemies, and to himself, in some sense, because Vlad had sacrificed his own country, his own people's stability, his own moral standing in the world to build that field, was a man of a different order entirely. He turned his army around. He left a subordinate force to continue operations, supported Vlad's rival, and returned to Constantinople. Wallachia survived, not cleanly, not without enormous cost. Vlad would be driven from his throne later that same year, betrayed once again, this time by the King of Hungary, his supposed ally, who imprisoned him on ambiguous charges rather than support him as he had promised. He would spend years in captivity before returning to power briefly, and dying in uncertain circumstances, sometime around 1476 or 1407, but in the summer of 1462, with a forest of the dead standing between the greatest army in the world and the last remnant of his nation's independence. He had done something that almost no one in the medieval world had managed to do. He had made Mehmed the Conqueror flinch. That is not nothing. That is, by any honest measure, everything. There is a particular kind of violence that history does to certain figures, not the violence of war, or of politics, or of the slow erosion of time. Something more precise than that. Something more deliberate. It is the violence of the story. The moment when a real human being with a real history and real motivations and a real complicated moral ledger gets flattened into a symbol, pressed between the pages of someone else's narrative until all the dimension is gone, and what remains is useful and simple, and almost entirely untrue. This is what happened to Vlad Dracula, and understanding how it happened, who did it, why they did it, what tools they used, and why it worked so extraordinarily well, is, in many ways, just as interesting as anything Vlad himself ever did, because the making of the monster is its own story. And like all the best stories, it says at least as much about the people who told it as it does about the man at its center. We should begin with the Germans, specifically with the Saxon merchant communities of Transylvania, the cities of Brasov and Sibiu, wealthy trading hubs whose prosperity depended on commerce that moved freely across Wallachian territory. These communities had their own interests, their own political alignments, and their own long-standing grievances against Wallachian princes who had, at various points, imposed trade restrictions that cut directly into Saxon profits. Vlad, who ran a tight economic ship and had little patience for what he viewed as foreign merchants exploiting his territory, had come into direct conflict with the Saxon traders on multiple occasions. He had raided their settlements during periods of political tension. He had executed Saxon merchants he accused of supporting his rivals. He had, by the accounts of the Saxons themselves, impaled people in and around their communities in ways that were clearly intended, at least in part, as messages to the merchant class about the consequences of working against him. The Saxons, understandably, were not fond of him, and the Saxons, crucially, had access to something that was, in the 1460s and 1470s, among the most powerful communication technologies in the world. They had the printing press. Johannes Gutenberg had introduced movable type printing to Europe, only a decade or so before Vlad's reign of terror reached its peak. The technology was still new, still exciting, still capable of producing the kind of novelty effect that makes people pick something up and read it simply because it exists in a form they haven't seen before. Pamphlets, broadsides, short illustrated texts. These could now be produced in quantities that handwritten manuscripts never could, and distributed across trade networks that stretched across all of Central Europe. The Saxon communities produced a series of pamphlets about Vlad Dracula that circulated widely through the German-speaking world in the years following his reign. These texts, historians have identified more than a dozen distinct versions, were not subtle documents. They were, by the standards of any era, sensation journalism. They described, in vivid and often illustrated detail, the tortures and executions attributed to Vlad. They gave him methods. They gave him dialogue. They gave him a personality, sadistic, gleeful, inventive in his cruelty, that bore the clear marks of authorial embellishment. Vlad, in these pamphlets, did not merely impale people. He dined among his victims. He had people boiled. He had mothers forced to eat their own children. He nailed turbans to the heads of Ottoman envoys who refused to remove them, a story almost certainly distorted from the actual diplomatic incident that was considerably more complex in its political context. The pamphlets sold. They circulated. They were read aloud in taverns and marketplaces. They were copied and translated. They became, in the cultural vocabulary of late 15th century Europe, the definitive account of who Vlad Dracula was, and they were written by his enemies. The Ottomans did their own work on his reputation, though with different tools and for different purposes. Ottoman sources from the period portray Vlad as a kind of useful demon, a figure whose savagery could be acknowledged and even, in certain registers, grimly respected, precisely because it helped explain why the great campaigns against him had been so costly and so inconclusive. If Vlad was a monster, then the Ottoman failure to simply crush him was not a failure of Ottoman arms. It was an encounter with something outside the normal parameters of war. It served the Ottoman narrative to make him extraordinary, just as it served the Saxon narrative to make him irredeemably evil. Neither account was primarily interested in accuracy. There is also the matter of his own allies, the Hungarian court, which had imprisoned Vlad, remember, in 1462 on charges that were at best murky and at worst entirely fabricated as a political convenience, had its own complex relationship with his reputation. On one hand, the Hungarians needed Vlad to be dangerous enough that his value as a military commander against the Ottomans was self-evident. On the other, they needed him controllable, dependent, useful rather than autonomous. The version of Vlad that emerged from Hungarian court sources is therefore a peculiar hybrid, a man of extraordinary military gifts, who was also, conveniently, somewhat unstable, a weapon that needed to be held carefully. This framing allowed the Hungarian crown to position itself as the responsible steward of a necessary but volatile force, which was politically useful in ways that a straightforward account of Vlad as competent, independent, and betrayed by his allies would not have been. The people who recorded history in the 15th century were largely the people with the reasons to shape it. And then there is Bram Stoker. We cannot talk about the legend of Vlad Dracula without eventually arriving here, at a Victorian novelist working in the British Museum in the 1890s, surrounded by notes and travel books and folklore collections, assembling what he intended to be a Gothic horror novel about a Transylvanian count with a very particular appetite. Stoker almost certainly encountered the name Dracula through a book called Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, written by a British consul named William Wilkinson and published in 1820. Wilkinson's account mentioned, in a footnote, that the word Dracula meant devil in the Wallachian language. Not an entirely accurate translation, but close enough to lodge in a novelist's imagination. Stoker took the name. He took the location, Transylvania, with all its existing Gothic atmospheric associations in the European imagination, and he built around them a creature of pure supernatural horror, draining the historical Vlad of almost every specific biographical detail, every political context, every human motivation, and replacing them with something that served the needs of his story. Count Dracula, the vampire, is not Vlad Dracula the prince. The connection between them is, historically speaking, almost entirely nominal, and yet the novel was published in 1897, and it was a sensation, and it was adapted and readapted through the 20th century in ways that Stoker could not have imagined, until the image of the Transylvanian vampire count became one of the most globally recognizable fictional figures in human history. Every time someone puts on a black cape, or talks about stakes through the heart, or references Transylvania as a place of Gothic menace, they are, at several removes of distortion, touching the shadow of a man who lived and fought and bled in the 15th century, and never drank anyone's blood in his life. There is something genuinely strange about that. Something almost philosophical. The way a real human being can become so thoroughly colonized by a fictional construct that the two become impossible to separate in the popular imagination, even when the historical record is right there, perfectly accessible, telling a story that is frankly more interesting than the invented one. What does it mean then that we remember him this way? It means, in part, that the Saxons were very good at propaganda. It means that Bram Stoker was very good at atmosphere. It means that the Gothic imagination of the 19th century needed certain landscapes, certain figures, certain vessels for its anxieties about blood and death and the persistence of the past, and that Transylvania and the name Dracula were simply available in the right place at the right time. But it also means something about Vlad himself, because the legend required a seed. The pamphlets were exaggerated, certainly, but they were not invented from nothing. Vlad did impale people in enormous numbers, with a consistency and a methodology that went beyond military necessity into something that has to be honestly acknowledged as systematic, chosen, and in some register, deliberate in its theatrical quality. He knew what he was doing to his reputation. He was, in some sense, the first author of his own legend. The forest of stakes outside Taguvinte was not merely a military tactic, it was a composition, a statement made in the most visceral possible medium, addressed to the widest possible audience. He made himself a monster, at least in part, on purpose, because a monster, he had learned, was something that empires thought twice about crossing. The Saxons took that and ran with it. Stoker picked it up centuries later and ran further still. And the real man, the orphaned hostage, the patient exile, the brutal and brilliant prince who held a small country together against forces that should have destroyed it, receded further and further behind the story that everyone found more useful than the truth. He is still back there, though, waiting as he always waited, with considerably more patience than the legend gives him credit for. There is a particular cruelty that time reserves for certain kinds of men, not the cruelty of the battlefield, which is at least honest in its intentions, not the cruelty of political enemies, which operates according to rules that a sufficiently intelligent person can learn to anticipate and navigate. The cruelty that time reserved for Vlad Dracula was quieter than either of those, more patient, more corrosive. It was the cruelty of irrelevance, of watching the world reorganize itself around new alliances and new priorities while you sat in a room that was comfortable enough to survive in, and too confined to matter from. It was the cruelty of being forgotten while you were still alive. To understand how Vlad arrived at this point, we have to return to the autumn of 1062. He had driven the Ottomans back. He had done the thing that virtually no one believed a Wallachian prince could do. He had faced the full military weight of Mehmed the Conqueror and emerged, if not victorious in any clean and celebratory sense, then at least standing. Wallachia was still Wallachia. The Ottoman advance had been turned. The forest of the dead had done its work. And then everything collapsed. The mechanism of collapse was, by this point in Vlad's life, almost boringly familiar. It was betrayal. It was the people who were supposed to be on his side, deciding that the calculus of loyalty had shifted, and adjusting accordingly, with the particular unsentimental efficiency that medieval European politics had elevated to an art form. His brother Radu, the younger brother who had been taken into Ottoman captivity alongside Vlad all those years ago, the one who had, unlike Vlad, genuinely assimilated into Ottoman court culture, who had converted, who had become a favorite of Mehmed himself, was now being positioned by the Ottomans as the alternative Wallachian prince, a more manageable option, a man who would pay his tribute and maintain the peace and not build forests of dead soldiers on the approaches to his capital city. The Wallachian boyars, ever sensitive to the direction of prevailing winds, began shifting their support toward Radu. This alone might have been survivable. Vlad had faced boyar disloyalty before and dealt with it in his characteristically permanent fashion. But the blow that actually undid him came from the north, from Hungary, from the king he had fought alongside, or at least in parallel with, whose interests he had served by keeping the Ottomans occupied in Wallachia while Hungary managed its own frontiers. Matthias Corvinus, king of Hungary, arrested Vlad Dracula in late 1462. The precise charges have been debated by historians for centuries, and the honest answer is that they were almost certainly either fabricated or catastrophically exaggerated. Matthias produced letters, allegedly written by Vlad, in which Vlad appeared to be offering submission to the Ottomans, an act of treachery that would have justified, legally and politically, removing him from the alliance. Most historians who have examined these letters with any care have concluded that they were forgeries, or at minimum, gross misrepresentations of whatever actual communications they were based on. But Matthias needed Vlad out of the way, for reasons that had less to do with actual treachery and more to do with the complicated politics of crusading finance. Matthias had received substantial funds from Pope Pius II, earmarked for a crusade against the Ottomans, and had spent a considerable portion of those funds on other priorities. Vlad, who had actually been fighting the Ottomans with everything he had, represented a rather inconvenient rebuke to that decision. A man imprisoned on charges of collaboration was considerably less embarrassing than a man standing free and pointing out the gap between promised and delivered support. The letters were convenient. Matthias used them. Vlad was taken to Visegrad, to a tower above the Danube, and there he remained for somewhere between 12 and 14 years, depending on how precisely one dates the beginning and end of his captivity. Vlad Dracula lived as a prisoner of the Hungarian crown. The conditions of his imprisonment evolved over time. In the earlier years, they appear to have been relatively austere: confinement in Visegrad's tower, limited contact with the outside world, the particular psychological weight of a man accustomed to complete authority finding himself entirely without it. Later accounts suggest that his circumstances improved considerably. He was moved to more comfortable quarters. He was allowed to hunt, which was itself a significant privilege, a concession to his status as a prince rather than a common criminal. He converted to Catholicism. Whether from genuine conviction, political calculation, or simple accommodation to his circumstances, is a question that admits no certain answer. He married a relative of the Hungarian royal family. The accounts differ on exactly who she was, but the connection to Matthias's court is consistent across sources. He had children. He built something resembling a life inside the walls of his captivity, which is either a testament to human adaptability or a heartbreaking thing, depending on how you choose to look at it. The man who had governed an entire principality with an iron absolutism that made even hardened Ottoman commanders uncomfortable was now living on someone else's sufferance, hunting deer in someone else's forest, sleeping each night in rooms he had not chosen. What he thought about during those years, history does not tell us. The inner life of Vlad Dracula in captivity is almost entirely inaccessible. There are stories, almost certainly apocryphal but persistent, that he continued impaling things during his imprisonment. Mice caught in the corners of his room, birds, small animals that wandered within reach, that he could not, even in confinement, fully suppress the habit of the gesture. Whether these stories are true, they reveal something about how the people who lived alongside him perceived him, that there was something in him, even diminished, even caged, that remained recognizably itself, unassimilated, unresolved. The world outside his window continued to move. Radu ruled Wallachia for much of this period, a compliant Ottoman vassal who maintained relative stability precisely by not being Vlad, by paying what was asked, not provoking what could not be won, not building things from stakes and bodies in the fields outside his capital. He died in 1475 of syphilis, and the Ottoman-aligned succession in Wallachia began to falter. Mehmed, meanwhile, had continued conquering Bosnia, Albania, the Italian city of Otranto, briefly, which sent a shiver of genuine panic through the papal court and all of Western Christendom. The Ottoman threat had not diminished. If anything, it had clarified itself, and the argument for Vlad, the argument that had always been his strongest, the argument grounded simply in the fact that he was the single most effective anti-Ottoman military commander in the region, began to reassert itself in the corridors of Hungarian and papal strategic thinking. Matthias released him. The exact timing is uncertain, but by 1475 and into 1476, Vlad was free. He was participating in military campaigns in the region, fighting alongside Hungarian forces, reasserting himself into the military landscape from which he had been absent for more than a decade. In the summer of 1476, he was restored to the Wallachian throne for the third time in his life. He was somewhere in his mid-40s. He had been a hostage, an exile, a prince, a fugitive, a prisoner, a husband and father in captivity, and now, again, a ruler. The accumulation of those identities, the weight of living that many lives within one, is almost impossible to fully imagine. His third reign lasted approximately 2 months. The circumstances of his death in late 1476, or possibly very early 1477, are genuinely uncertain. This is not a failure of historical investigation. It is a reflection of how chaotic the situation in Wallachia was during this period, with Ottoman-backed forces pressing in, boyar loyalties shifting again, and the larger Hungarian strategic picture pulling resources in multiple directions simultaneously. He was killed in battle, most likely. Some sources suggest assassination, that his own men turned on him in the confusion of an engagement, which would make his death the last and most complete iteration of the betrayal pattern that had defined his entire life. Some Ottoman sources claim his head was taken to Constantinople and displayed, which Mehmed may or may not have ordered as a final punctuation mark on a rivalry that had lasted 15 years and cost both men more than simple accounting can measure. His body was buried, according to most scholarly consensus, at the monastery of Snagov, on an island in a lake near Bucharest. Archaeological excavations in the 20th century found a grave in the expected location that contained no remains. Whether because the body was moved, never placed there, or disturbed in the intervening centuries, no one can say for certain. He left behind 2 sons from his Hungarian marriage. He left behind a principality that would not remain independent for very much longer. Wallachia would fall fully under Ottoman suzerainty within decades of his death. Its brief, bloody, improbable resistance absorbed at last into the empire that had always been patient enough to wait. He left behind, too, the stories, the pamphlets already circulating, the whispered accounts that would grow and mutate and travel, and eventually, 4 centuries later, find their way into a Victorian novelist's notes and emerge as something unrecognizable but unkillable. He left behind a name that the world has never quite been able to put down. That is a strange kind of immortality, not the one he would have chosen, almost certainly, not the one he fought for. But perhaps, in the end, more durable than the throne, he bled for 3 times and held, in total, for only a handful of years. The man dies. The story does not. And somewhere in the distance between those 2 facts, Vlad Dracula remains, neither fully human nor fully myth, neither fully condemned nor fully understood, still waiting, as he always waited, for someone to tell it right. Every civilization leaves behind the things it cannot resolve, not the things it conquered or built or legislated into order. Those get monuments and textbooks and names on public buildings. What a civilization cannot resolve, it turns into stories. It turns them into figures who stand at the intersection of the questions it keeps asking itself and cannot answer. Figures who embody the tensions that refuse to collapse into simplicity no matter how many centuries pass over them. Vlad Dracula is one of those figures, and the reason we cannot let him go, the reason his name still moves through the culture with a vitality that most actual historical figures never achieve, is not because of the vampire. Not really. The vampire is the costume. Underneath it is something far more enduring, far more uncomfortable, and far more relevant to the world we are still living in than any Gothic novel or horror franchise has ever quite managed to articulate. What we cannot resolve when we look at Vlad is a question he embodies with more force and clarity than almost any other figure in the historical record. What is a ruler allowed to do to protect the people he rules? It is worth sitting with that question for a moment before we rush past it, because it is not an abstract question. It has never been an abstract question. It is the question that sits at the foundation of every political philosophy ever seriously attempted, from the city-states of ancient Greece to the constitutional democracies of the present day. Every society that has ever organized itself around a governing authority has had to answer it, in one form or another, and the answers have varied wildly, across cultures, across centuries, across the specific pressures that specific historical moments have applied to specific populations trying simply to survive. Vlad's answer was extreme, by any standard, by the standards of his own time, which were not gentle, and by the standards of ours, which have their own considerable capacity for organized violence when sufficiently motivated. His answer was extreme, but his circumstances were also extreme. This is the thing that the pamphlets ignored, and that the vampire myth buried entirely, and that serious engagement with his history continually forces back to the surface. Wallachia, in the 15th century, was not a stable country navigating ordinary political challenges. It was a fragment of territory caught between 2 of the most powerful military forces in the medieval world, governed by an institution, the Wallachian throne, so structurally compromised by internal rivalry and external interference that simply holding it for a decade was an achievement most of his predecessors could not manage. In that context, the ruthlessness was not incidental to his success. It was the mechanism of it. He did not govern, despite the terror he deployed. He governed through it, in the literal sense. The terror was the infrastructure. The impalement of the boyars who had destroyed his family was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the dismantling of the power structure that made stable governance impossible. The field of stakes outside Targovite was not madness. It was the most cost-effective psychological weapon available to a commander who could not win a war of attrition against an empire with essentially unlimited manpower. He was doing math. Terrible, human, irreversible math. But math nonetheless. Calculating what was necessary and doing it without flinching. Because flinching was how his father had died, and his brother had been buried alive, and his country had been passed back and forth between empires like a disputed inheritance. That does not make it right, but it makes it comprehensible. And comprehensibility, in a figure this extreme, is its own kind of vertigo. Romania has never fully resolved its relationship with him either, which is itself a kind of testament to his complexity. He is, in Romanian historical memory and national identity, a genuine hero. Not an ambivalent one, not a complicated, but ultimately redeemed one. A hero, in the relatively straightforward sense of a man who defended his country against overwhelming odds with everything he had. Opinion surveys conducted in Romania across the late 20th and early 21st centuries have consistently found him among the most admired figures in Romanian history. There are statues, there are streets, there is a ruined castle on a cliff above a gorge that draws visitors from across the world, standing in the cold Carpathian wind and looking up at what remains of something he built with the forced labor of his enemies. He is claimed, in Romania, as an expression of national character in extremis, the idea that a small people, pressed to the absolute limit of what survival requires, will find within itself resources of resistance that larger and more comfortable nations cannot imagine needing. That is a particular kind of national myth, and like all national myths, it requires a degree of selective emphasis. It foregrounds the resistance and softens the methodology. It remembers the forest of stakes as a military masterstroke and processes the human cost of that masterstroke at a certain remove. This is not dishonesty exactly. It is the normal operation of collective memory, which is not the same thing as history and was never meant to be. But it is interesting. It is interesting that the same figure who became, in the Western European imagination, the template for the ultimate monster became, in the imagination of the country he actually ruled, something closer to the ultimate protector. Same man, same actions, opposite meanings. The gap between those two readings is not a gap in the evidence. It is a gap in the value systems being applied to the evidence, and that gap has never fully closed. The vampire, too, deserves a final accounting, not because it is historically accurate, it is not, but because the persistence of the connection tells us something real. Bram Stoker's Count Dracula is, among other things, a figure of inverted sovereignty. He is a ruler without a country, an aristocrat without a functioning court, a man of ancient authority exercising power over the living in ways that the living cannot sanction or resist or fully comprehend. He feeds on those who should be under his protection. He survives by consuming the vitality of others. He is immortal in a way that makes a mockery of the normal human relationship with time and consequence. There is something in that image that maps, however distortedly, onto anxieties about political power that are not specific to any century. The ruler who sustains himself at the expense of those he governs, the authority that cannot be killed by ordinary means, that keeps returning no matter how many times it appears to be defeated, that leaves its mark on everyone it touches. Whether Stoker was consciously reaching for any of this is doubtful. He was writing a gothic horror novel, not a political allegory, but stories have a way of accumulating meanings their authors did not intend, and the reason the vampire count has remained so culturally resonant across so many different contexts and adaptations is precisely that the anxieties it touches are alive and well. We are still living in a world that has not resolved the question of what power is allowed to do. We are still living in a world where small nations are consumed by large ones, where the choice between capitulation and resistance is a live question with no clean answer, where the people who make the terrible decisions that prevent worse outcomes are not remembered the way the decisions are. Vlad is still useful to us, in other words, as a mirror, as a question, as the extreme case that forces us to articulate what we actually believe about violence and governance and survival and the moral weight of context. He was a man of his time, and he was more than a man of his time. He was born into a world that was trying to destroy him before he was old enough to understand what destruction was. He was formed by captivity and loss, and the particular education of watching everyone who trusted the wrong people end up dead. He built a philosophy of power from those materials, and he applied it with a consistency and a thoroughness that made him effective and monstrous in proportions that are genuinely inseparable from one another. He protected his country. He terrorized his country. He asked more of his people than any ruler has the right to ask, and he asked it in service of their survival, and the line between those two things, the protection and the cost of the protection, is not a line that history has ever been able to draw cleanly in his case. He died in obscurity, more or less. A prince of a small principality, killed in a skirmish, buried in a monastery that may or may not still hold his remains, succeeded by rulers who could not hold what he had held, and eventually lost it entirely to the empire he had spent his life resisting. And then the stories took over. And the stories have never stopped. 550 years after his death, his name is known on every continent. The country he bled for is still there, still itself, its language and culture and identity intact. A fact that owes something, in the long and tangled chain of historical causation, to what he did in that terrible summer of 1462. Children dress as vampires every October without knowing his name. Tourists climb to his castle in the Carpathian cold without fully knowing whose hands built it or whose suffering funded the construction. He is everywhere and nowhere, remembered constantly and understood almost not at all. That is his legacy, not the impalement, not the vampire, not the nationalist hero or the Gothic villain. The legacy is the question he has never stopped asking, from whatever silence history has assigned him. What would you have done? And the uncomfortable truth, the truth that keeps the legend alive across centuries and cultures and contexts that he could not have imagined, is that none of us are entirely sure